Hello and welcome to the next in this series of videos about health, disease and medicine. So what we're going to be talking about in this video is we're going to be talking about how pathogens spread. We're going to talk about what a vector is, and we're also going to talk about how we can reduce the spread of pathogens. So a couple of things just to remind you to start with. Two key words. Okay, first off, pathogens. Okay, so a pathogen is a disease-causing microorganism. Microorganism. Another key term, host. Okay, the host is the infected organism. Okay, because we're going to use those two terms when we're talking about the spread of pathogens. Before we get into too much detail on each individual one, let's look at the broad spectrum of the different ways in which pathogens can spread. So, first off, we've got droplets. We've got spores. We have water. We have food. We have broken skin. And last, but by no means least, we also have vectors. So these overall are the different ways in which a pathogen can be spread. Now let's look at each one in a little bit more detail. Right, let's start with droplets. So what do we mean by droplets? Well, simply little bits of water. So whenever anybody coughs or sneezes, what happens is you will be expelling lots of water droplets that have come out of your respiratory tract. Now, a lot of the pathogens that cause you to cough and sneeze will be present in that mucus and water that you expel out when you cough and sneeze. Now, what happens is those droplets will then go into the air, and once in the air, most viruses and bacteria can only really survive for a short period of time, maybe not even a day. Now, clearly, if that goes straight onto another individual, that individual could then put those droplets into their eyes, mouth, or sort of broken skin, and the droplets will be carrying that pathogen and then it will infect that person. There are some that can survive much longer. So while most sort of viruses and bacteria survive for just one day, TB, okay, which stands for tuberculosis, that tuberculosis bacteria can mix with dust and survive for months. Okay, so how do we stop the droplets spreading? Well, simply this can be things such as covering your mouth, masks. Certainly at the moment of me making this, we're currently in a pandemic where wearing a mask doesn't sort of necessarily prevent the pathogen from getting into you, but it prevents you from putting the pathogen on other people. And washing hands. Now, the reason I put washing hands in there is because if you get droplets onto your hands, you wash them, you're getting rid of the pathogen. So what about spores? Now, spores is sort of unique to fungi, okay? So this is fungal infections. Now, when fungus come to reproduce, what they will do is they'll produce spores. Now, those small spores are very, very small. They get transferred from one organism to the other by being carried in the wind. So those spores are just carried by the wind. Now, because they can be carried by the wind, they can also travel long distances. Now, with regards to fungus, there are some loads of different ways in which you can treat them. There's sort of chemical treatments and various other things. But on the whole, when it comes to treating, you just have to remove the infected plants. Or the infected fruit, whatever it might be that's got that fungal infection. Right, next up, we've got water. So we've already talked about in droplets how certain pathogens can exist in small droplets of water. And obviously, if you've got a large supply of water, there can be the risk of pathogens in it. Now, this only tends to really happen with dirty water. Now, we are very fortunate in where I live in the UK, we have an incredible network that provides us with what we call potable water. Now, potable water is clean water. It's sort of, it's been treated and it is free of pathogens. Now, in areas which are less developed, what we end up with is we end up with less potable water. Developed areas. So we'll have less potable water. Now, what they need to practice in these places where maybe sort of clean water isn't as available is they need to practice good hygiene. And this brings me on to how we actually treat those pathogens that are found in water. Okay, good hygiene. What do we mean by good hygiene? Well, good hygiene just means cleaning to remove pathogens. So, other things that we can do to that water is we can treat the water with chlorine, or we could even boil the water. But essentially you need to have a good system of water purification to make sure that that dirty water isn't what is being taken into the mouth. Next on our list is food. Now this is a bit of a disgusting one to talk about because there's different ways in which bacteria can get onto food. Now the main thing is that we end up with pathogens on the food. Now the question is, how do those pathogens get on the food? So, one thing is food being handled by, how can I say this? Someone with poor hygiene. That's what I'm going to say. Someone with poor hygiene. Now, what are some examples of that poor hygiene? Well, the first is that they could cough and sneeze onto their hands, put the droplets into their hands, and then touch food that they're preparing for you, or preparing for yourself, it could be. That is an example of poor hygiene. The bacteria or pathogen or virus is now going to be on that food, and you're going to ingest that food. Now, food that is ingested in this way, or a pathogen that's ingested in this way, this is known as the oral route. I'm just going to write this in green. Oral route. So when a pathogen enters via the mouth, that is known as the oral route. Now here's the disgusting one. So the disgusting one is if somebody goes to the toilet and they don't wash their hands after they've been to the toilet. I'm not just talking a number one, I'm also talking a number two. And this has a name, okay? This is known as the oral fecal transmission. Yes, that's right. Bacteria from the feces of another individual can find their way onto their food. I'm sure you may have even seen in the news or certain articles surrounding ice. You shouldn't really have ice in your drinks. Why might I say something as absurd as that? Well, it's been shown that the ice that's prepared in certain restaurants and in certain parts of the world is prepared by people that do not wash their hands, and they in fact found fecal matter within some bits of ice. There we go, you're never going to look at ice in your drink the same ever again. I apologise for that. Do some research and you'll find quite a few different articles that talk about that kind of transmission. So again, how do we prevent, okay, the sort of transmission via food? Well, again, we have this concept of good hygiene. Hygiene. We also have to make sure that food is cooked completely. So, for instance, if you're cooking something like chicken can have some bacteria called E. coli in it that can make you very ill. If you cook the chicken completely and it's 100% cooked, then you will kill all of the E. coli, so it won't therefore be able to be transmitted to you because it's dead. Right, on to the last two. We've got broken skin and vectors to go. So broken skin, why have I got this one? Well, some pathogens can just make their way easily into the bloodstream. Okay, so easy access to bloodstream. An example of this is Ebola. Ebola was found to be incredibly contagious and very able to get in via an open cut. HIV is another one that can get in through that. So we've got this idea of broken skin. So here, how do we actually protect this? Well, nice and simply, we just cover it up. And what we need to do is we need to introduce a barrier. So an example of that could be a plaster, or it could be something like Vaseline to help seal a cut. Last in our list, vectors. So vectors is when pathogens are transferred by other organisms. Now, an example of this is malaria. Now, malaria is transferred by mosquitoes. So we have mosquitoes being our vector. So if we're looking at the example here, mosquitoes, what they will do, they will suck the blood of an infected individual. Can just about fit this in. Okay, and then they will transfer it to the next individual or to the next feed. Yep, so they sort of basically go across to somebody, suck their blood, they've got malaria, the plasmodium will then be in their gut. When they then get to the next individual and they stick their proboscis in, which is their needle bit that they drink through, they will then put some of that infected blood into the individual, and there'll be a little bit of transmission there, and it only takes a very small amount. So how can we treat sort of pathogens or stop the spread of pathogens that spread by vectors? Well, what we do is we stop the spread of the vector. So how can we do that? Well, we can't necessarily stop the spread of mosquitoes, but what we could do in this example is use mosquito nets, or we could use insect repellents to stop the mosquitoes actually biting yourselves. So, in summary, what have we talked about in this video? We've talked about how pathogens are spread. We've talked about droplets, spores, water, food, broken skin, and vectors. We've talked about what vectors are, and we've also talked we can prevent the spread of pathogens by each of these means. So what we'll be talking about next time is we'll start to talk about some of the defenses. What we'll talk about next time is we'll talk about some of the defenses that the human body has to prevent these pathogens from getting into our bodies. What's our first line of defense against these invisible microorganisms that cause us to become unwell? So, if you've enjoyed the video, give it a like, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and thank you very much for watching. And as always, I will catch you in the next video.